Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. Kane. We're talking about Canada at war here, and we're talking conscription. So, how does the government get people to agree, I guess, to conscription?
Well, the issue of conscription is, for historians, it's clouded by the way the government introduced it. The historians generally see this as Borden's attempt to kind of keep the Conservatives in power because, of course, there should have been an election in 1916, but instead of that, he approached Laurier and said, the war will probably be over soon. Why not just let things, slide? Let me have my parliament for another session. And Laurier said, okay. But then in 1917, as I mentioned earlier on, Borden asked Laurier to form a united government, and this united national government, and that they would all bring conscription in together. And Laurier said no, but lots of members of the Liberal Party went along with this and decided to join Borden. And of course, after the war, Mackenzie King would get them to come back to the Liberal fold. So the Union government actually goes to the polls on December the 17th, and they won a decisive victory, and I'll explain why. But lots and lots of soldier support for it, and conscription, although it's passed as a result of this, it really doesn't become, I think it's passed in the September, but it doesn't really become the reality for people until January of 1918. So there's lots and lots of propaganda, I mentioned this as well, saying that a vote for Laurier was a vote for the Kaiser. Propaganda posters were aimed at the soldiers on the Western Front, so you get the government sending out like little things for them to put on the sides of sheds. And this is one quote, a vote against the government means you are here for life. A vote for the government means another man is coming to take your place. Well, that's pretty convincing, I think. Lots of posters showing, you see a machine gun belt, and you see a machine gun, and you see the belt with all the bullets going down. So posters showing posters showing soldiers feeding votes through their machine gun instead of bullets, and the heading underneath, every Union ballot is a bullet for the Kaiser. There's also a poster campaign that's targeted towards women, who of course are going to get the vote in the hopes that they'll bring in conscription, and they're quite good actually. You see the kind of evil Hun out of the window, with this pointy little hat on, looking kind of like really devious and twirly moustache like, and then you see a woman, nicely dressed woman, and she's pointing a gun at the Hun, but of course it says on the gun vote, so you're shooting them with your weapon. So in that case, the heading on one of those posters is, "A loyal government has placed a weapon in your hand to defend yourself against the murdering burglar who would treat you as he has treated your Belgian sisters. Make good use of it by supporting the government." And then just other ones where you see the Kaiser racing across like kind of an open field, and he's being followed by what looks like just a sleet of bullets, but of course every single bullet has the word vote on it, so he's been wiped out by votes for the Union government. Quebec votes Liberal mostly for that particular election. Quebec returned 62 Liberal MPs. I think the Liberals probably only get something like 3 MPs outside of Quebec, and the rest kind of goes to the Union government. So, but it's really interesting. So you get this Union government going to the electorate in December the 17th, I think 1917, winning the election, taking most of the seats. And then Borden and the Union government take the West by, of course, promising exemptions to farmers' sons, but it's not long before he actually has to kind of claw those back. So he introduces, and I'll just talk about 3 things, he introduces the Military Services Act, that's really conscription, into law in September of 1917, not in use, as I said, until early 1918, and there's riots in Quebec City as a result of the introduction of this. But there's 2 other really key pieces of legislation passed in 1917, and one is the Wartime Elections Act and the other is the Military Voters Act. So the Wartime Elections Act is that one that allowed women to get the vote. which is as it should be anyway. So allowed women that were related to soldiers or women who were involved themselves in military work, say you were a nurse on the Western Front as well, to receive the vote on the assumption that they would vote in favour of conscription. And you know, you would want to send other people over to replace your relatives. I've always found this a bit odd, though, because there must surely have been some women in the country that didn't have men serving overseas. So if they voted in favour of conscription, they would be voting to send their, you know, their brother, husband, and that doesn't seem right. But still, that's the way it went. And at the same time, as I also mentioned, naturalised Canadians arriving from 1902 on, or the people coming from the Axis powers, or conscientious objectors, they lost the vote. And one of the interesting things about voter history is that people tend to vote for the government that was in power when they entered the country. So that would just have all been Liberal votes anyway. You know, it's like if they're like, that's okay, take it off them. They wouldn't have voted for us anyway. So it disenfranchised citizens of enemy alien birth naturalised after 1902. Except if they had a son, grandson, or brother on active duty, and of course, you know, women get the vote as a result of this. He also passes the Military Voters Act, which gave the franchise to all members of the armed forces, and of course, there are native men serving. Quite a high participation of native men serving, so they would have got the vote too. And so allowed, it's crazy because you wouldn't, I don't think you would see this today. I could be wrong, but I don't think it would be allowed today. So if you put your name, if you were a soldier, all you could do was vote for or against the government. So vote for or against the Union government. So if you put down your constituency, that you say you came from someplace in Saskatoon, then your vote would be applied there. But if you didn't put down your constituency, they could just take all of your votes and put them into the big giant bag that they no doubt had, so a big giant sack of votes, and then they could apply them to any constituency anywhere in the country. So say you were the Union government and you were losing by 500 votes in Edmonton, Strathcona, then you could go into your big bag of votes and you could get 501 votes out of it and stick it on there and then win there. So it's like really, really crazy. So a military voter could cast his ballot not for a specific candidate, which is the standard procedure, but for the current government or for the opposition. If you didn't put your constituency on it, then they could use your ballot anywhere they wanted. So with the ability of assigning votes, the governing party was able to use the vote in a constituency that was beneficial to the party. So very, very interesting. I said to you that the election campaigning was kind of nasty. It says, during the election campaigning, the newly formed Unionist government fought with Liberal opposition largely on cultural lines, and the result of the election saw the Unionist coalition government led by Borden receiving 2/3 of the constituencies outside Quebec, but of course only 3 votes inside Quebec. 90% of the soldiers' votes went to the Unionist government. 90%. You couldn't dream a better number, I think, than that. And of course, if you can apply them wherever you want, then you're happy. So, you know, one of the questions that you could ask is, did conscription work? Well, you know, it causes a few problems in the short term, but it ends the finger pointing, and most people apply for and receive exemptions. So there's actually 320,000 under the Class 1, is kind of single guy. So 320,000 and 300,000 asked for exemptions. So only 20,000 of that. And I think the exemptions are really, really high. Something like 94% of people that applied for exemptions in Quebec and 87% that applied outside of Quebec actually get those exemptions because people are needed for war work. There's necessary war work. Mining would probably be one of them. It is in Britain. And farming. You know, because we are going to make that economic contribution to the war effort as well. So that, in a sense, it doesn't involve, in the end, it doesn't involve a lot of people. The other thing about it, though, is that because it is something that is very divisive, when you get to World War II and you have Mackenzie King, the Liberal leader, in power, the first thing he does is when it's clear that war is going to break out again, he's like, okay, I'm planning this whole thing out, and we're going to talk about conscription before we even go into war. And he says, we're not going to conscript, so you don't have to worry. And then, of course, during the war, it becomes clear that maybe they're going to have to use conscription, and so he has that famous saying, not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. But at the end of the war, people understand that he didn't want to introduce conscription, and that he took it to a referendum, and that there was just the same kind of split. Anglos going, yeah, okay, we understand, and French Canadian go, no, we don't really understand this at all, we don't approve of it. But it doesn't affect the Liberals in their kind of post-war elections. So it does have a long-term impact. And of course, I suppose if you're one of the people conscripted, then it would have an immediate impact on you. So you have, after 1917, then you have a volunteer army, and you also have a conscripted army, and you've got those people on home defence as well.
Was Canada ready for war?
No. I don't think you can be ready for war when you've only mobilised in the Northwest Rebellion and right. you've been off to the Boer War. So I don't think that you could really expect a country that doesn't have a standing army and that doesn't have conscription to be ready for war. There should have been military plans, and I think there were military plans in place. But it's Sam Hughes as the Minister of Militia that's in charge of everything, and he gets really overexcited. And the minute war breaks out, there's a little NFB documentary about him, and I guess he was really, really worried that on August 4th, he's like, oh, I hope Britain doesn't back out and then there won't be a war. It's just like part of this whole incredible excitement about it. Like, I hope they stick to their guns, when we go off and fight. So the minute the war is declared, he just kind of telegraphs everybody at all the different militias and doesn't kind of follow his own plan. So he did have kind of a plan, but he doesn't really follow it. So we're not really ready for war at all. And one of the big wartime issues is, of course, technology. And the biggest issue for Canadians is the Ross rifle, or for Canadian soldiers, the Ross rifle. And you need a little bit of background to understand what's going on with the Ross rifle. Sir Charles Ross had been involved in the Boer War, and he said that he would build a factory in Canada during the Boer War and would produce small arms. And of course, he ends up producing this now infamous Ross rifle. The Canadian government wanted to use the Lee Enfield that the British were using, but the guy who was producing the Lee Enfields needed all of his wartime production, needed to be kind of tailored to the British. So you get Charles Ross, produces the Ross rifle, and we're going to use that. And Sam Hughes found out quite soon that the Ross rifle jammed in the rain and mud. It did really well in all the tests, but they just tested in kind of perfect conditions, which doesn't seem right for guns. But he knew that they jammed and that they had problems, but he refused to change them, and thousands of Canadian soldiers died as a result. There are all sorts of different battles where a third to a half of the Ross rifles would jam and they just couldn't use them, and you just could not get them to function. And so what soldiers would do is they would crawl out into no man's land under cover of darkness, take the Lee Enfield rifles off of British soldiers, bring them back and try and use those. So it's absolutely disastrous. And it, in part, this is his downfall. And I'll just read you from this account. This is called, "They died cursing the rifle they couldn't fire. It jammed, overheated, and its long barrel attracted snipers, but Sam Hughes wouldn't admit that his beloved Ross didn't work." So this is Private Donald Fraser from Alberta's frontline 31st Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force, who left September of 1915. And he said of the Ross rifle, "It's cost the 1st and 2nd Divisions many lives. Sam Hughes and his admirers defended this rifle persistently despite wholesale condemnation by the men who used it and the musketry experts of the British Army. Its chief defects are that it's too long and it shows above the trenches. It's continually catching in the overhead trench signalling wire. It doesn't balance in the shoulder well and it tilts to the side, the muzzle catching in the mud. With so much open metal surface and mechanism, it's difficult to keep clean, keep it from rusting. But the principal objection is that it jams. The least thing jams it. A speck of dust, a shower of rain, a burst of rapid fire, and very often there's difficulty in loading. The Ross rifle is a standing joke amongst the Imperial troops." And then it just goes on to talk about when they were used or when they were delivered. And actually, in this little article, it says that they were first issued to the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, 1,000 of them, and withdrawn a year later on the grounds of weakness of design and manufacture, and that was in 1905. And then it went through 80 design changes to a kind of Mark III version that was more expensive than Lee Enfield and longer and heavier. And this is another. This is from the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. The Germans attacked, and this guy from Calgary's 10th Battalion spent a day and a half in a shell hole with four other men, and said, out of 5 Ross rifles, it took 4 of us to keep one of them working. Can you imagine being a soldier and been faced with that kind of nightmare? As soon as you fired a round, you had to sit down and take the entrenching tool handle to bash the bolt out before you could load it again. It wasn't safe to send a 14-year-old kid out rabbit hunting with, never mind going into battle. And then another Edmontonian, a major in the 3rd Battalion, blamed the Ross for the carnage about him. He said, a man standing right against me had just emptied his rifle and was trying to open his bolt, stuck as usual, when 3 machine gun bullets passed right through his body. Another brave man gone west. In a few minutes, another one died about 10 feet to my left, trying to draw the bolt on his Ross rifle by putting the stock on the ground and a foot on the bolt. Many a good man was killed the same way that day, forgetting that the parapet was so low, and he was absolutely infuriated. And another officer said, it's nothing short of murder to send our men against the enemy with such a weapon. A private remembered, there were fellows crying out in the trenches because they couldn't fire their damn rifles. Of the 5,000 Canadians who survived 1,452 had thrown away their Rosses and picked up Lee Enfields from dead British soldiers or units going out. It's an absolute freaking nightmare of a technological problem, and the soldiers kept complaining, and the government had actually bought 342,000 of them before the complaints that were piling up and being sent to Sir Douglas Haig, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Forces. He recommended finally that Canadians be rearmed with Lee Enfields, and so by June of 1916 they followed that recommendation, and just goes on to say that the Ross rifle was one of the reasons why Robert Borden fired Sam Hughes as the Minister of Militia in November of 1916. And as soon as he fired him, and Hughes had done this before, he just attacked Borden and said all sorts of nasty things about him. And in fact, the guy that had been in charge of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the British officer who had been in charge of them, he had also said right from the get-go, as soon as they reached Britain, these rifles are terrible. And Hughes just denounced him as a coward. And so that was his response to kind of everybody. So he's the guy in charge. The other thing is, in this question of was Canada ready for war, is that you had to muster somewhere, right? You had to get everybody together, like, oh, there's a war, quick, come with me. And so he had decided that they would muster at Valcartier, which is just outside of Quebec City, and still used to this very day by the army. And so about 31,000 men arrived at Valcartier that September, and then in October they set off for Britain. There was like 15,000 horses, 31,000 men, poorly equipped. All they did when they were at Valcartier were like leapfrogging. They did because you need that in the trenches. You got to leapfrog over people. So leapfrogging, aerobic exercises, calisthenics, what looks suspiciously like Highland dancing, stuff like that. Running at things with your gun. So no homegrown officers, not much discipline, and the worst thing was that he sends out this telegraph to people like, come to Valcartier as quickly as you can. They all show up. And of course, there's no rail line from Quebec City to Valcartier. When people get there, there's nothing there. It takes like 400 people have to work to actually build the barracks so that they've got some place to stay before they go. So Canada not well prepared. poor soldiers that were all excited to go and sign up and go off. Get to Valcartier, and they're like, oh, a big field, how nice.
Not even
and Sam was waiting for them, to sing. He sang to them as they left on the boat as well.
Boy.
And we'd read bits of poetry and things like that. Yeah.
Well, that's it for this part of our episode on Canada at War.
Yes, and we're getting into the nasty stuff now, the actual battles. So we're going to look a little somber. Don't worry about that. Okay, bye.